I bought a lake house. The HOA said they owned my dock. They were wrong. I didn't buy the lake house for the square footage. I bought it for what was out back, a sliver of shoreline, a worn wooden dock jutting into calm water, and a view that made me feel like I'd finally exhaled after decades of the daily grind. The listing mentioned an easement, but my agent said it was standard boundary language around waterfront property. Nothing to worry about. I skimmed the survey, saw nothing alarming, and closed on the place. My plan was simple: fish after work, take my old aluminum boat out on weekends, and finally have a place where the loudest sound was a loon. The neighborhood had an HOA. The seller disclosed it. I figured it handled road maintenance, maybe kept the entrance looking tidy, the same low-stakes arrangement I'd had at my previous home. My next-door neighbor, a retired guy who spends his days doing woodworking in his garage, summed it up on my first afternoon there. "They're active around here," he said, carefully. I asked what that meant. He smiled and said I'd find out the moment something that looked like a boat appeared in my driveway. It took 2 days. I was standing on that old grey dock one evening, tossing a spinner into the water, minding my own business. I had a current fishing license. The boat, a beat-up trailer rig I've owned for years, was parked beside my garage, not blocking anything, not visible from the road. I was, by any reasonable measure, the most boring kind of lakefront homeowner imaginable. Then a golf cart came barreling up the path from the community side and chirped to a stop behind me. "Excuse me." She introduced herself as the HOA president before I could respond, a woman in a bright visor holding a clipboard like it was a citation book. She told me I was fishing illegally at the community dock. I told her I was standing on my own property at a public lake with a valid state fishing license. She told me that wasn't how things worked around here, that the dock was a community amenity maintained by the HOA, and that fishing required a permit issued by the association. She also informed me that my boat was stored in violation of community aesthetics. I laughed. I genuinely thought she was hazing the new neighbor. She was not. 2 days later, I had violations in my mailbox. 1 for the boat. 1 for fishing without an HOA permit. 1 for an unpermitted shoreline structure, which was the dock that had been there when I bought the place and that I had not touched. The total was several $100s, with a warning that non-payment would result in further action. They'd even slapped a sticker on my mailbox. My wife asked if I was just going to pay it and move on. I told her no, I don't pay for problems that don't exist. I emailed the address on the violation notice and asked 3 straightforward questions. What specific rule prohibited a legal-size boat stored in my own driveway? What authority gave the HOA the power to issue fishing permits on a state-regulated lake? And what document established that a dock on my property was a community asset? Their reply was a masterpiece of self-importance. The boat violated community aesthetics. The dock was maintained by the HOA and therefore subject to HOA regulation. I needed written approval for any shoreline feature, and fishing from the dock without their permit interfered with other residents' enjoyment. I wrote back again, still politely, and asked them to point me to the exact document, the recorded deed or easement that gave them legal control over my shoreline. I asked what state statute permitted them to regulate fishing. They went silent for a week. Then a new invoice arrived, this one with late fees and a note threatening collections. My neighbor in the garage told me what I suspected. The dock had been there as long as anyone could remember. The HOA had simply declared it a community amenity over the years, started charging an annual lake access fee, and nobody had ever pushed back because it was easier not to. He never paid. He doesn't fish, but plenty of his neighbors did. They had been collecting money for access to something they very likely didn't own. Here's where my professional background came in. I'm not an attorney, but I work with property records for a living. I know how to read deeds, easements, and plats. I pulled the county GIS, the tax maps, and the full file from my title company. I spent an evening going through every recorded document attached to my parcel. There were 2 easements on my property. 1 for utility lines near the road. 1 small drainage easement nowhere near the lake. Nothing granted the HOA, or anyone, access to my shoreline, my dock, or the path leading to it. I hired a licensed surveyor anyway, because if I was going to push back, I wanted it airtight. The surveyor and his crew spent the better part of a day setting stakes. When they were done, one of them walked me to the back of the property. He showed me the rear boundary line, then walked along it and pointed down toward the water. "The dock," he said, is entirely within your parcel. Not partially, completely. Every post, from where it attached to the shore out to the end, sat on my land. The access path did too. No recorded easement for any of it. He handed me a business card and said, "I'd be careful letting people keep using this. Any liability falls on you as the owner." I notified the HOA in writing. I explained that I had hired a licensed surveyor, that the dock and path were confirmed to be on my property, and that no easement existed granting them access. I told them I was willing to discuss a formal license agreement, a legal, documented arrangement, but that they needed to stop sending me fines in the meantime and rescind the existing violations. Their reply was immediate and almost impressively dense. They claimed that long-term community use had established a right. They said they maintained the dock, therefore it was theirs. They threatened to escalate. The next day they sent me another fine, this one for harassment of board members. When the annual dock access email went out to all residents, a cheerful newsletter announcing that members could renew their lake access fee for the season, listing key pickup dates and fishing time slots, something in me shifted. They were still collecting money for my property, while fining me for standing on it. I called an attorney I'd worked with before on a small business matter. I walked him through the situation, sent him the closing documents and the surveyor's sealed letter, and asked what my options were. He asked one question: "Do you want to keep letting them use it, or not?" "Not under these conditions," I said. He drafted a demand letter. It was concise and very clear. The dock and path were on my land. The HOA had no recorded right to use either. They had collected fees from residents for access to property they did not own. We demanded they cease representing the dock as a community asset, rescind my violations, and pay a back land use fee for the years of unauthorized use. We attached an invoice. The number wasn't outrageous. We based it on fair market land use rates, but it was substantial enough to get attention. The HOA president showed up at my door the following afternoon with 2 board members. She held the letter like it had personally insulted her. "You think you can extort us with this?" she said before I could greet her. I told her it wasn't extortion. It was a bill. They had used my property for years without permission and charged their own members for the privilege. That's not a community tradition. That's unauthorized use of private land. She told me the HOA had built and maintained the dock, and that gave them rights to it. I asked her to show me the recorded document that said so. She threatened a lawsuit, a lien on my house, and legal action I'd regret. The quieter board member beside her tried to pump the brakes. "Let's not threaten litigation on his porch," he said. I told them I was willing to negotiate a proper license agreement, but until that happened, the dock was closed. She pointed at me, delivered a warning that sounded like it came from a town hall villain in a bad movie, and left. Their attorney sent a letter 2 days later claiming implied easement through long-term use and common area established by practice. It ended with a promise that any interference with dock access would trigger immediate legal action. My attorney called. "How attached are you to being friends with your neighbors?" he asked. I told him I'd tried. We sent a formal notice. As of the following week, the dock and path would be closed to HOA members and the public. Crossing my property after that date would constitute trespassing. The letter included the surveyor's legal description and the sealed drawing. I went to the hardware store. Heavy chain, 2 quality padlocks, a stack of red and white no trespassing signs. My neighbor from the garage helped me sink 2 posts at the property line and run a chain between them. We posted signs at eye level along the path and at the dock entrance. Clean, clear, unaggressive, just accurate. The next morning, I was pouring coffee when I heard voices rising outside. A small crowd had gathered at the chain, people carrying fishing poles and lawn chairs, pulling at the lock. The golf cart arrived. The president got out, made a sweeping gesture, and announced to everyone present that the situation would be handled. Then she pointed at me and told me to unlock it immediately. I told her the dock was closed and that the board had been notified in advance. She called the sheriff while everyone watched. The deputy who responded was calm and professional. He walked the path, looked at the survey stakes and the posted signs, and turned to the president. This appears to be his property. There's no criminal violation here. This is a civil matter. If you believe you have an easement, you'll need to take it to your attorney." He left. The crowd dispersed in that particular way people do when they're inconvenienced and looking for somewhere to put their frustration. By evening, The HOA had sent an email to all residents announcing the dock was temporarily closed due to a dispute, and that the board would be taking appropriate legal action. They described my conduct as harassment. What they did not do was produce a single recorded document establishing their right to use the property. On the third day of closure, a man jogged down the path, saw the chain, looked around, and climbed past it. My wife called out from the window asking him not to trespass. He responded with a gesture I won't detail here and kept going. I called the non-emergency line. The same deputy came out, recognized the situation, and asked the man to leave. The man argued that he paid for dock access. The deputy asked him to show proof of an easement. There wasn't any. No arrest, just a clear instruction not to return. Meanwhile, residents who had paid their seasonal dock fees were wondering what exactly they'd paid for. Parents who brought children to swim. Kayakers. People who simply liked to sit near the water with a book. All of them were now locked out, not because of me, but because the board had refused to acknowledge reality and negotiate. The HOA called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. I went. The president stood at the front with a printed map that creatively suggested the dock was somehow community property. When my turn to speak came, I kept it simple. I had a sealed survey showing the dock was entirely on my parcel, no easement existed, and the HOA had been charging residents for access it had no right to sell. The room shifted. A woman in the second row asked the board directly, "So we've been paying you for nothing?" An older man in a fishing hat asked how the HOA wasn't liable for selling access to property it didn't own. The board's attorney tried to pivot to prescriptive easement theory. I raised my hand and pointed out, as politely as I could, that prescriptive easement claims require a court process, not a newsletter announcement, and that you cannot simultaneously claim a prescriptive easement and fine the property owner for using his own land. On my way out, 2 different neighbors pulled me aside quietly. Both said the same thing in different words. They were tired of the way things had been run, and they appreciated that someone had finally looked under the hood. Over the following weeks, the pressure tactics shifted to guilt. Notes on my door asking me to think of the children. A printed flyer that read, "It takes a village." A certified letter announcing that legal proceedings were being initiated. My attorney told me to relax. If they had a recorded easement, it would have been in their very first letter. It wasn't there because it didn't exist. He was right. We were never served. Instead, after the posturing faded, a letter arrived from a different law firm, a more sober one, saying the new attorneys had reviewed the survey and the recorded documents and were recommending the board cease representing the dock as a community asset. They proposed a meeting to negotiate a license agreement and asked me to resubmit my invoice. After a month of bluster, they blinked. We met at their attorney's conference room. My attorney on one side, theirs on the other, the president and 2 board members across from me. My attorney laid it out methodically. The survey, the absence of any recorded easement, 15+ years of unauthorized use, the newsletters advertising the dock as a community amenity, the collected fees. He placed my invoice on the table. The president accused me of greed and selfishness. My attorney replied, without raising his voice, that her client had profited off the community for 15 years by charging fees for access to property it didn't own. The quiet board member rubbed his eyes. Their attorney tried to negotiate the back fee down to a nominal amount. We made a small concession on interest and held the base. When they asked for a permanent easement in exchange for payment, we offered a revocable annual license instead, renewable, terminable for cause. We also required a public written correction of any statements about dock ownership and a formal rescission of all my violations. At one point, the president announced they'd take their chances in court. Her own attorney paused, seemed to weigh the value of candor, and said gently, "I would not recommend that." The room went quiet in the way rooms do when people realize the argument is over and they lost. We adjourned without a signed agreement. My attorney told me to give them a week. They called in 3 days. Word had spread. Residents whose families had spent summers at that dock were showing up to board meetings in numbers the board wasn't used to seeing. Someone posted in the neighborhood forum, "Why did we pay dock fees if the HOA never owned the dock?" The thread ran long. The president emailed me at midnight. We would eventually settle on a number close to my original ask for the back land use fee, plus a 1-year license with renewal options. The agreement included specific terms I set, reasonable hours, a guest limit, liability insurance naming me as an additional insured, and a clause that any future fine issued to me for normal use of my own property would void the license immediately. The HOA was also required to publicly correct its prior statements about ownership and rescind all violations in writing. They signed. They cut the check. I waited for it to clear. Then I took the lock off the chain. I kept the no trespassing signs. They were accurate, and added a new one at the dock entrance that read, "Dock access by license only. For information, contact HOA." The HOA's correction email to the neighborhood read like it had been written by someone holding their breath. It said the dock was located on private property, was not owned by the HOA, and that a license agreement had been reached allowing member access. It apologized for any confusion about ownership. Buried in the middle was a single paragraph noting that my violations had been rescinded due to a misunderstanding. I didn't have to do what happened next. It happened on its own. Residents who had paid dock fees for years started asking where the money had gone. A group of them pulled together old emails, newsletters, and meeting notes, more than a decade's worth, and asked the board for a full accounting. The board produced a one-page summary citing maintenance, upkeep, and insurance with round figures. The residents asked for receipts. Then they called a special meeting to vote on removing the president from the board. She made a speech about tradition, community, and the damage one disgruntled resident could do. It didn't land. When the paper ballots were counted, the result wasn't close. She was removed. The quieter board member took over as interim and announced a full financial review, handled by an independent CPA, with results to be shared with residents. The accountant's report came out several weeks later. The dock fees had gone largely into the general fund. Some had paid for an insurance rider that didn't legally apply to property the HOA didn't own. Some had covered those solar lights on the path. A small amount had paid for a pressure washing of the dock that my neighbor recalled as one board member's nephew borrowing a power washer for a Saturday. No outright embezzlement, just years of sloppiness, entitlement, and treating other people's money like it wasn't worth accounting for. The board offered partial dues credits to any resident who asked and committed to posting receipts for all future maintenance claims. As for me, I got the settlement check and the annual license fee, paid in a lump sum at the start of each season. They pay, I unlock. They don't, I lock, and I fish from my dock whenever I feel like it. The neighborhood is quieter now, in the good way. The new interim board answers questions without making people feel like troublemakers for asking them. The dock is open to license-holding residents during reasonable hours, kept in decent shape, and nobody's collecting fees for access they can't legally sell. I didn't set out to become anyone's hero. I just didn't want to be fined for standing in my own backyard. Turns out, that was enough to change quite a bit.